Good morning and welcome to today's NENS webinar, which is entitled Client Case Study, Security and Simplicity in 2021. My name is Ted Halsey, and I'm your host for today's event. First, let's go through a few housekeeping items. All participants are in listen-only mode. Today's session will be recorded and circulated to all registrants. Thank you for joining in for the live session. Your questions are strongly encouraged throughout the presentation. I will be monitoring the Q&A log in real time, and we'll be sure to ask our speakers your questions as we go along. We are also sending you a 1-minute survey at the conclusion of the event. We look forward to your input and feedback on the conversation. Now let me introduce our speakers. Michael Kirkalakis is a principal at NENS. Michael, welcome.
Thank you, Ted.
And Christian Sanchez is a security consultant at NENS. Welcome, Christian.
Thanks, Ted. Good morning.
And Kevin Dushney is VP of Information Technology at Chimera and a special guest for today's event. Kevin, welcome.
Thanks, Ted. Good morning.
Okay, now let me turn things over to Michael to review the agenda and get us into the conversation.
Thanks, Ted. I want to make sure everybody can see my screen, Ted. I just want to do a check. Is that, are we good? Excellent.
We're good.
All right. All right. So yes, special thanks to our special guest, Kevin. I really appreciate him taking the time to come join us today. He'll add a lot of great value to the discussion. I'd like to now review what is on deck. Today we're going to go over password and identity challenges. We're going to talk specifically about what single sign-on is, considerations for implementation, what we're seeing and how our clients are benefiting, and practically speaking, we're going to just take you through a couple screenshots of what the user experience is like for an SSO setup and application. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Christian. He's going to review our next topic, which is password and identity challenges.
All right, thanks, Mike. Yes, so passwords, our favorite topic here. So first problem that we have here is that we have way too many passwords. Research has shown that the average person has about 100 passwords, and you know, I before this webinar, I said, yeah, that can't be right, is it? And I looked at my own password manager, and I have about 200 passwords between my work passwords and my personal ones. So the struggle is definitely real. The next issue is that, you know, we're human. So there's different password policies, different change intervals. So we start to get sloppy and we recycle our passwords. We make them too easy. And it's these weak passwords that really put us at risk. A lot of these applications have lax password policies out of the box, and a lot of vendors do this. You know, whether or not it's intentional, but really they don't want to deal with customer pushback, excess support calls. If you think about the time you could waste a good chunk of your morning trying to get your passwords reset for various applications. So as we stated before, you know, we recycle our passwords a lot, and this leads to breaches and resource exposure. So a lot of employees will sometimes use their work emails to sign up for non-work services. So think of things like maybe your LinkedIn account, or even something as innocuous as, you know, you want to order some beer and have it waiting for you at home. You get on Drizzly's website, you sign up with your personal, or not with your personal account, but your work account. So what happens is that then these services get hacked, and if you're using the same password there, now the employee's resources are at risk because those stolen credentials could be used to log into corporate email, VPNs, etc. So really, MFA is still the key. We've talked about this before in previous webinars. It's still extremely important, but there are some shortcomings. It is the single most important feature to boost security. However, where it starts to break down is when you have multiple multi-factor authentication methods to maintain. So you turn on Duo over here, you turn on SMS enrollment over here. You know, you have to remember to check off a box. Every time you onboard one of these new applications for a new user, if you don't do all the steps properly, that's when we start to miss things, and that's where we get put at risk. And this brings us to single sign-on, or SSO. So what is SSO? As I said before, it's single sign-on. It's the notion that you log in once securely with multi-factor authentication, and then you securely have access to all your company applications and approved data, or approved applications and data. And it sounds really easy. It sounds very simple, but there's a little bit more to it. So let's talk a little bit about how it actually works. So for each of these different applications, they all have their own set of login credentials. You have a username and password here, a username and password there, and generally they can be different. So what we do is we look at all your SSO compatible applications. These are your service providers such as Office 365, Salesforce, Box, Zoom, etc. But what if we take all those username and passwords and we sort of tie them back to a single sign-on provider? So there's only one password database, sort of one and done. You have one username and password to log into all your application. That's it. That's the notion of single sign-on. So do we want to use MFA or single sign-on? We want to use both of those because by verifying the identity of the user, you can restrict or allow access to your applications from one central location. And the nice thing there is that it makes it easier to onboard your users. It makes it easier to offboard users. You only have one username and password to disable. If somebody's credentials are stolen, well, that's why we have multi-factor authentication. So really it kind of helps with security. And Mike, do you want to talk a little bit more about the security aspect of that?
Yeah, I do. Thanks, Christian. There is this thing called zero trust when you're talking about SSO providers. And what zero trust means is that you can no longer just go to, as Christian mentioned, the provider's Office 365 or Zoom. You can no longer just go to their websites and then log into the portal. You're going to be redirected back to the SSO provider for the login. And that's a huge benefit because as we all know, Office 365 is the number one, most hacked web service right now because most people don't put MFA in place, they don't put SSO in place, and a lot of people are on Office 365, so that gets attacked. Well, if those attacks are going at Office 365, but Office 365 will not allow you to log in, even if your password is 123, that's going to significantly reduce the risk of breach happening within Office 365. Actually, a little bit towards the end of our presentation today, we're going to, as I mentioned, we're going to show you a little bit about what that user experience looks like.
Yeah, just a quick comment on that, Mike. It's a good question to ask your software provider if you're onboarding them or you already have them, if they'll support forced SSO. Not all providers will do it. So it becomes more of a convenience. I can hit the chiclet in Okta or Azure to sign into the app, but I can still go directly to the application and sign in using a local password. So not all platforms will support forced SSO, so that's something to keep an eye out for in terms of security, and also offboarding employees. And you might have someone that's left the company and still has access to the app, and you think they don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is critical, and I'm glad you brought that up. And it is really critical in the selection process, as you mentioned, Kevin. We're working with our clients and even working with prospective clients. Some of them are really quick to sign up for these, for cloud-based solutions and cloud-based applications, thinking it's going to make their life easier. And if they don't have a well thought out selection process, that's one of the questions that gets missed, right? Can you use MFA? Is there SSO? Can it be forced SSO, right? It kind of goes down the line. I'm glad you brought that up. That is a critical point.
Yeah, and we kind of glanced over a little bit, what about the SSO providers out there? Are these things that we're familiar with? We did throw around the word Okta a little bit, and Kevin also touched on Azure AD with Office 365. But here at NENS, we really talk a lot about Okta. This is the platform that we really prefer. It's the most robust. It has a proven track record. Little or no downtime have ever been reported by Okta itself. It's just a very mature product. We also look at Duo, which is actually an MFA provider, but they're getting in the SSO game as well. So there are other products out there that do this, but these are sort of our preferred platforms. So Mike, should we talk a little bit about how we, well, we did talk a little bit about implementation considerations. Anything else there that we should factor in?
I mean, really, how does it kind of simplify stuff? And Kevin actually alluded to it around onboarding and offboarding, right? Just a couple of points here. So we'll talk about Okta specifically. Okta has a really great product called Lifecycle Management as well. And when you're utilizing that, especially with onboarding and offboarding of employees, you can actually, if I take a step back, so if you think about adding a new employee, it takes anywhere from about 20, 30-ish minutes to set up an application per employee, right? You log into the portal, you set up their username, you set up their password, you give them credentials, you give them, there's policies and permissions, and there's things that need to get set up. And just taking a look at the data that we have, and also looking at the data from some of these SSO providers, what they're saying is it is about 30 minutes per application. Well, let's say you have 6 applications, right? So it's an hour, 180 minutes, hour and a half per employee. Now what you're doing is you're setting up the user, in Okta, say that takes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And then all those applications are auto provisioned, and back to what Kevin mentioned before, you have to make sure that those apps can be auto provisioned, but we'll just assume here that they can. It's a pretty significant time savings and cost savings, and the experience for that new user is awesome, right? They're onboarded with the apps that they need, with everything that's just the way that they want it. But it's not only just a situation of time savings, right? When you think about it from an operations standpoint, a security standpoint, the human element of error is now removed, right? Because now when we're assigning them to a particular profile and we're bringing them on board, as I mentioned, the applications are rolled out exactly the way that they were programmed, the permissions are rolled out exactly the way that they were supposed to be. It's not like, oops, I forgot to set this thing up, or oops, I gave them access to the senior executives, folder or application stack. So all of those kind of errors go out the window. And then offboarding is really important as well. So today, if you don't have something like this in place, you have to think about, okay, what are all the different applications that employee had access to, right? But with SSO, once you shut off their ability to log in, then they don't have access to all of the applications, 6, 8, 10, whatever it might be. So it's really one place that you go, you shut it down, you disable their account to get access to that, and it's pretty amazing. Another major benefit from a simplicity standpoint, and I can tell you from experience for us, a lot of our clients expect us to know what applications they have, who has access to the applications. They even ask us, how much are they utilizing that particular application? Am I spending money for no reason? So from an auditability standpoint, from reporting on applications that are in use and who has access to them, not every SSO app, package, but many of them give you that ability to be able to see exactly, what's happening across the enterprise. And as you have some application sprawl, you continue to go more and more to the cloud. It's pretty beneficial. Kevin, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to add from your experience as it relates to that.
Yeah, no, you hit on a lot of key points. I think once you have those sets of applications set up, when a new employee joins the company, you can do sort of birthright type assignments, meaning stuff everyone gets in the enterprise. It's very easy. In fact, you can automate a lot of that. So they get a 365 account, they might get a Zoom account, and then you're adding additional applications based on their individual needs. So it becomes a great way to centralize both the security of logging in, but also the convenience to the employee of, I have one dashboard of applications. I go there, I get into that habit of hitting that portal and just clicking on the resource I want and signing into it. So there's a lot of benefits from security to convenience that I've found.
Excellent. And we're going to show you a little bit later on exactly what that looks like, what Kevin just explained. Yeah. We did promise to go over some implementation considerations, and I am going to oversimplify here. But getting to simplicity takes some work, right? It doesn't just happen. It's not magic. And I also want to be careful about making sure that people understand this is not a how-to class. I'm not going to open up the portal and show you exactly what step-by-steps are to make this happen. But I do want to go over kind of the framework that we put in place when we're rolling this out. The first phase that we have is discovery. So in discovery, we're understanding what we're trying to protect. We're talking about the main objectives, who are the users that we're protecting, what type of profiles and policies and so forth that we're going to put in place. As we talked about before, going through all the applications, are they compliant? Can you do the forced SSO, right? Going through all those things to understand exactly what the scope looks like for the particular SSO project, and if it's going to achieve those goals. You know, as I mentioned before, permissions, and then, you know, what's the source of truth for identity management, right? Are we going to utilize the SSO provider? Are we going to use Active Directory? Are we going to use Azure AD, right? There's different ways of approaching it, but really, discovery is exactly what it sounds like. It's just really taking a look, you know, across the enterprise and understanding, you know, here's what we're trying to accomplish. What is all the stuff that we have? And then once we understand everything we have, now we go into the planning phase. So the planning is, you know, how are we going to tackle this particular implementation, right? What does that look like? You know, how are we going to test it? How long will the test run? We want to define what success looks like. We want to have some metrics in place. We also want to make sure that we have, you know, target dates. You know, we want to, you know, if we're going to use like a Scrum method or something like that, you know, we want to be, you know, racing towards something. And then, you know, are there self-imposed budgets that we want? You know, how long something should take, right? Are we trying to understand, all right, well, the first time we did it, it took 10 hours, but now that we know it, it's documented, it only took 5 hours. So it's like trying to understand what that budget's really going to look like when we get into doing the full rollout. Next is testing and beta. So you really need a test group, right? Just rolling out SSO to the entire company is not a good practice, right? You know, it'll give anybody who's in charge of IT a lot of headaches. Leadership will get pretty upset. So we want to, you know, pick a select few and put them in the test group. As I mentioned, you know, we want to figure out, you know, how long do we think that this test should run, or do we let the test run until we have everything worked out, which is, you know, we try to do both, right? We try to work hard towards an end goal, but we really want to run everything through and make sure that we have the application set up properly, that the settings are done, we work out any of the bugs and the kinks, and then once we feel like we have the test group thumbs up, as I mentioned, we'll have, you know, metrics on keys to success, and with that, we'll make sure that we have all those things before we think about going to the general rollout. So next part is general training. So before the rollout, and I should have mentioned this even in the testing, training is critical, right? This is where most implementations of anything fail, but specifically in SSO. So with single sign-on, if people don't know what the experience is like, they don't know exactly how to use it, no matter how well it's set up from a technical standpoint, the rollout is going to fail. So you have to have, you know, really great testing, and then as I mentioned, you have that beta group. So, you know, bring them through the testing, and you'll figure out where the gaps might be, and then you can update it and then really try to make that rock solid. Next part is the actual implementation go live, right? So your training's complete, and now you actually have a date. And that is one of the, you know, if you do all the other steps right, it's the most simple, right? It's everybody's ready to go. They have the training. We pick a date. We do the cutover, and now everybody's logging in from the SSO provider. The other part that's really, really important is you have to plan out how are you going to do ongoing support and how are you going to do changes. You know, so hey, we need to roll out a new application. Okay, well, what does that change look like? How are we testing it and so forth? So that part from a discovery and planning standpoint as well is really, really critical. It's really trying to map out what, you know, ongoing and how you're going to support you know, this SSO service as you move forward into the future.
Hey, Michael, could we jump in with maybe a question? Steve from the audience wants to know, I mean, how do you know if your organization is a good fit for SSO? I mean, what are some of the, you know, challenges or specific security concerns would make a company a good fit versus not for another company?
So it's a great question. And I think going to this next slide might highlight a couple of those things. And if it doesn't, I encourage Steve to ask another question, a pointed question. But I believe that actually after we go through some of these things of presenting the case of where a couple of these clients were before we implemented SSO and what the considerations were, I think hopefully that'll answer the question. Do you think that's fair, Ted?
Great.
Awesome. All right, so we're going to focus on two clients. Client one is in financial services. Client two is in life sciences. The financial services company, there were 25 users. They had 3 cloud-based applications. And those cloud-based applications they utilized first, there was nothing in place from a security standpoint, meaning like MFA and SSO, multi-factor authentication, two-factor auth, and single sign-on. And a couple years ago, we said, hey, look, everybody has to do this, especially if you're governed by specific regulations, such as FINRA and so forth. And so we work with them to now set up MFA across those apps. One of the challenges is that it's multi-factor authentication is different from all three of those applications. They're lucky they only had three, right? And another example, there's 6, 7, 8, 10. So now you have these multiple different methods. There's like a different maybe push application on your phone, or you're getting a text message, or you get an email. So there's all these different methods of how this MFA took place. So that was challenging. And the other part was there was no way for us to look at it and be able to go through an audit with this organization. And they say, hey, I want to ensure that every user has this set up and they're using it in this method, right? Because a lot of this, the user has a little bit of authorship over when you have these individual applications, and they can set up which way they want their security to happen through MFA and whatnot. So they came to us and they said, hey, we need to make sure that this is if we get audited, that these things are locked down. So then we talked to them about utilizing an SSO, right? We looked at specifically Okta. And luckily for us and for them is that all three of these applications were part of the Okta integration, on that Okta integration list. So we were able to now go to them and say, okay, well, we can set this up for you. We'll be able to do that auditability and reporting across all the applications that are set up. We can force the applications to utilize this specific security method and own this particular method. And that was a huge benefit for them, and it put all the checks in the boxes of the things that they were trying to achieve. I know Christian was actually involved in the rollout of that. I'd like to ask him to add some additional color to it if he can.
Yeah, I mean, you pretty much hit on all the points there. So, when we had this campaign to get everybody on multi-factor authentication, and the best way, back to the discussion about, how do you control MFA, without missing any steps. So by putting it sort of behind this single sign-on wall and enforcing MFA at the top, that was the best and most efficient way to really assert multi-factor authentication to log into these apps. And the great thing is that now they're on there. I believe we even added another app down the road, and we just presented it to the users as another app and give them access to it.
Yeah, and before I go to the next one, just to try to also address it. So, things as far as consideration is one is you have to do that discovery, right? The discovery is a great first step just to see if the project is a worthwhile exercise, right? So when you go and you look at things, and the things you want to look for is how many cloud-based applications do I have? Are those cloud-based applications, do they integrate with a specific SSO provider, right? Or can they? Because as I mentioned before, some of these applications are not very well built, right? They're not built on the standards of like OAuth and SAML, and I'm using a couple of technical terms here, but they have to be built in a way that this stuff can work together. So we need to identify that. I know this kind of gets off on a tangent, but if you have if you're in a situation where either due to regulation or because of your clients, and have underpinning contracts and language in there that states that you must keep specific information, secure to a specific level. You really need to take a look at what you're using, and if it can't accomplish that, then you have a different project that you have to do, right? So you have to make sure that whatever it is that you're utilizing from an app standpoint, or how you're utilizing data, is that you can protect it to the way that it needs to be protected. And once we get to that part where we know that that's there. It's very similar to the case of the financial services company. It's okay, well, what is it that we're trying to achieve, right? Do we need to achieve specific compliance, right? Do we need to achieve something for our clients? We have an audit that we need to pass on an annual or biannual basis, right? So those are some of the key considerations from when do I have to do this? The other part of it is this just good to do? Right? There are specific things within technology that I don't care what business you're in. If you're in business, there are just certain things that you absolutely have to do. This is one of those things where if I look at like the Massachusetts privacy law as an example, it says, you need to take reasonable measures, is what the quote says, to secure your environment. Well, do you want to do the bare bones minimum to secure your environment, or do you want to take the next step and do something like this, where, I've done well beyond that? And where that really comes into play, is if there ever was a breach and personal information is lost by your employees or your clients or whatever it might be, and then they come to you and they say, hey, what did you do to make sure that my stuff was protected? Well, not only did you take reasonable measures to protect the data, but you went even above and beyond that. So, God forbid you have to have a day in court and you have to sit down and you can say, hey, look, industry only does X. I've done, well above and beyond that to try to protect the data. So that's another area of just consideration when you're thinking about utilizing, SSO and putting, in general, just other security measures in place. The next company, Life Science Organization, when we implemented this, at the time, they were a 30 user company. They had nothing on premise. Everything was cloud, so all cloud-based applications. But they were now in this growth phase. And with that growth phase, as we were looking out and as we were planning, there was a growing need around compliance and security, right? And the need was, and the restrictions were increasing. So when we started this off, there were only about 4 applications that needed to be protected. And then as we're in the middle of the project, they started bringing on this new, this new application, this new ELN electronic lab notebook, that came into play, that now is part of it. Then there was another application. So even in the middle of us doing the discovery and the planning, they started bringing in other things that they wanted to protect. And for all those things that we just mentioned earlier about, easy onboarding and offboarding employees, application setup and so forth, they grew from 30 to 55 users, right? So now think about that. We added 25 additional users from the time that we did this project. Just the whole streamline of process, ensuring things are set up exactly where they need to be. The end user experience was really, really great, where they come in and they have one place to go to get access to all their applications. They're not hunting and pecking within their, within their, Microsoft and Mac to figure out, where the application lives and what they have to have access to. It was a real great way for them to see exactly what they needed to run the business. And the other part that we'll look at in the demo, and not the demo, but the user experience slides in a minute, is it's going to show you how the applications present, right? And depending on your role and profile within the organization, you're just going to see the applications that you have access to and that you need to function within your role as your organization. And I'll leave that at that, and then I don't want to do too much of a spoiler of the upcoming slides. But Kevin, I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to talk about. I know you've rolled this out a few times at organizations. I don't know if you wanted to talk a little about your experience and maybe even help answer the question about what drives people to do this.
Yeah, I mean, I've rolled out Okta, I think 6 times now across different companies in my career, and common themes are it instantly improves the level of security around your set of cloud applications, and the employees love it from an experience standpoint. It's one place to go to get access to the majority of apps that are in the cloud, and people love that, hey, I've got one dashboard and I can just click on the app I want to get into. So, I think it's appropriate for really any size organization. If you're a new org, the likelihood that you're cloud native is very high. I would say you're obviously not a fit if you have a lot of legacy systems that are on premises or don't support single sign-on. It's not going to be very helpful, but even small companies end up with 6, 10, 12 apps very quickly. Whether it's planning tools, whiteboarding, your Office or Google Suite, it's very easy to get into a number of apps where it makes a lot of sense to orchestrate those through one sign-on technology. And I've used Okta. It doesn't have to be that. There are other players, which I think you'll get into. But Azure, if you're a 365 shop, is definitely an option. and they're getting better, especially in the last few years. But if you're looking to secure and add multi-factor, Okta or some of these other players are a great way to go. They now add some intelligence to the MFA, meaning I'm not prompted every single time to put the code in, which gets tedious for employees. So it uses intelligence around, hey, I'm in the US, but somebody just tried to sign in from, Australia or China at the same time. That can't happen. So I'm going to go ahead and challenge you. Or you're in a new country for the first time. I'm going to challenge you. So it adds some intelligence instead of just blindly prompting you every single login, which, that's how sort of Microsoft handles it with the free version of MFA and some other tools. So there's a lot of things that are add to that value and employee experience that, I've run into time and time and again across multiple companies.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, speaking of value, I just want to add one more thing that, especially in the case of client number 2, adding these additional applications, there's no cost per application, and it's strictly licensed by user count. So you could have unlimited number of cloud apps in your MFA console or in your single sign-on console. So that's a great value add for a lot of customers out there.
Yeah, and speaking of costs, one thing I throw out too is sometimes a application provider will try to charge you for an SSO setup. Don't pay that. Push back hard, because honestly, in this day and age, I expect that as table stakes now. But I'll see companies charge $2,500, $5,000 for a setup. That's an eyebrow raiser, or if they say they don't support it at all, to me that's a non-starter. Any cutting edge application should have single sign-on capability, and if they don't, I think you really ought to critically evaluate how important is that application to the enterprise before moving forward.
Exactly.
Great point.
We had a couple of slides in here that on the original take, and it got really, really technical, and we decided to pull them out to try to keep this thing within an hour. But Kevin did touch on a couple of points that I think are important. So depending on your SSO provider, it's not just about password protecting and whatnot. It does use things like geolocation. There are things also labeled as impossible travel, right? I logged in from Boston, Massachusetts, and at 4 o'clock, and then I tried logging in from Canada at 6:30, which we did see that in a log from one of our clients, and it was flagged that, hey, look, there's somebody that's trying to gain access from somewhere else. So there are a lot of additional things that come with some of these SSO providers, and that goes back to a little bit of that discovery phase, right? Of like understanding what it is that you're trying to accomplish and how much what you're trying to do. Many of the SSO providers, pretty in plain English on their sites, will show you like, hey, yes, we're really good at identity management and single sign-on, but here's all the stuff that we do to help protect you, right? Like this is how it all comes together, and some additional things that we do. So when you're looking at those different providers, it's saying, okay, well, what do I care about, right? One of the things that always comes into play is cost. And if it's cost neutral between 2 different providers, and one provides a lot of additional extra security around it, then then the choice might be really easy to go with the people that have a much more robust and established and mature offering. That's when you work with whoever your IT partner is if it's an ENS or whoever it might be, internal IT, to really suss out those things and understand what the best approach is and the way that you want to protect the organization. All right, so next part, I'm going to hand this over to Christian, and we're going to go through a little bit of a user experience, and then we're going to open it up for some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So on this slide here, we actually see what the actual single sign-on login process looks like. So here we're presented with a simple login screen. It doesn't look like any different than any other screen where you're presented with a username and password. So as long as you have a browser, whether it's Chrome, Explorer, Safari, could even be on a mobile device, you can log into this portal here. So once you log in, on the next screen, you're going to see that we're going to be challenged with our multi-factor authentication. So there's a couple different single sign-on providers, a couple different MFA providers. In this case, we're doing some experimenting with mixing and matching of using Duo security with Okta, and that's totally cool. You can use whichever platform you like to do. So we've talked about the multi-factor and sending that push that you verify your identity with. Once you complete that login process, on the next slide, we're going to see what the actual user sees.
Yeah, but actually, this is a good thing to quickly touch on too, Christian. So as people can see here, right, how simple this actually is. So it's going to, when you click on send me a push, let's say you clicked on that button, send me a push, and you have the application on your phone. It's going to pop up and it's going to say, are you trying to get access to this application within this region from this IP address and so forth? So it gives you some context as well, so you're not just hitting accept, right? But it really is as easy as just tapping on your phone and just hitting accept, which then moves you right over to this next screen.
Right, yeah. So on the flip side, if you're sitting there eating dinner and your phone buzzes, it says that somebody's trying to log in, or that you're trying to log in from Siberia, you can hit the big red X and say, no, that's not me, and call up, contact your IT provider. So once you're logged in and you've verified who you are, you're presented with this panel, like Kevin used the word earlier, the little chiclets, the little buttons that you can press on. So each of these applications that you can click on will actually take you and log you into the respective application. So you can see here you have a bunch of different things. I think I even added, my Easy Pass as just a little shortcut. You can actually customize this, add in some personal things. If you have favorite websites, you can add them into the panel here. This is one of the reasons why Okta is so nice from an end user perspective, is that you can actually add your own shortcuts and links to here as well. So now what do we do? What if it's a user, a contractor, somebody who may not have the same level of access? Well, you just see less apps. So it's all based on group and application assignment. So if you don't want certain users to see all the applications, especially like your finance apps and things like that, you can certainly remove them so they're not published to that end user as well. So now the question that we get asked is, what happens if you try to bypass this? We did kind of touch on that a little bit. So let's say you say, all right, I don't want to log into the Okta panel. I'm just going to log into Office 365 itself. Let's say somebody steals your credentials and they try to log into Office 365 directly. So here you can see that, here's the Microsoft screen that we're kind of used to seeing when you log into your email or into SharePoint. You go ahead, you type in your username and password, you go to hit next, and you're actually going to get a single sign-on redirect. It's actually going to say, hey, it's not going to prompt you for your password here. It's going to bounce you back to, on the next slide, you'll see, you kind of get foiled. It's going to redirect you right back to that Okta login page where you then have to enter your name and password and then verify your identity with multi-factor. But you can see that it still says that it's trying to connect you to Office 365 during the login process. The other use case for this as well is, let's say you don't want to use the web interface. You want to use an application like your Outlook client, whether it's Outlook on your desktop or on your mobile device, or you're trying to log into the box.com sync to synchronize data. When you log into those applications, you'll actually be presented with this type of modern authentication screen where it'll actually redirect you back to Okta. So you don't have to live in that world of the panels if you don't want to. You can still live in your applications on your desktop as long as they're supported by the SSO vendor, and many of them are.
Great, thanks, Christian. All right, so we're a little bit ahead of schedule, but I'll hand it over to Ted and see if we have additional questions coming from the panel.
Yeah, so I just want to remind our audience, go ahead and submit your questions in the Q&A panel. But just a couple questions immediately come up. So there's one question here about, Christian, you were talking about the user experience and customizing. So does this eliminate the need for a password manager for most employees in an organization with SSO? Because they can kind of integrate, you mentioned that they can kind of customize and add additional credentials. Talk about that more. Unpack that a little bit, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where that sort of discovery phase is imperative, because as Kevin kind of touched on earlier, there are applications that don't support this full integration. Okta is nice because it does allow you to put in web links where it'll actually save your username and password, and essentially almost sort of be like a password manager, but you still need to know what your password is. If you're in a company that really only has just a small handful of applications and they're all SSO compatible, you can certainly just leverage Okta. You have your one username and password to log in. And one thing that we kind of skipped over is that that password could also be unified. Let's say you have Active Directory on premise to log into your computer. You can actually synchronize your Okta and your Active Directory password. So it's the same password to log into your computer, log into the Okta panel, etc. But if you do have other apps that aren't supported by single sign-on, that's something that you as a corporation, as a company, would need to decide. If you have a lot of sort of out-of-band applications and you want your users to be able to securely store your passwords, you could look into a password manager and then actually tie that into Okta and protect it. So you don't need to remember your password for the password manager. So it really is kind of part of that discovery phase of figuring out what the needs are of the company and how many applications we need to deal with. And that's where we're here to help.
Okay, and then I think one of the most common things with the SaaS ecosystem is just the pure variety and number of applications that just come down the pike. Can you talk about what the process is, either for an IT organization or for you?
So just so everybody understands, since Ted cut out,
As a service provider, find. Was I breaking up there a little bit?
You're totally broke up.
Let me try that again.
But we can. I think. Go ahead, Ted. See if we can try it again, and we'll run with it.
Well, yes. So when department heads and users find new apps, like what's the process to incorporate those new apps into the SSO application?
Yeah, so that's another good point as well, and I can touch a little bit on this first. So sometimes we see in these sort of less operationally mature organizations where there's a lot of sort of lone gunmen out there, people that want to try out apps and they start signing up for apps on behalf of the company and not really consulting with IT. So really you have to have a good relationship or maybe some policies that any new application has to get run through IT. So it's during that vetting process that we can discover, if we're looking at two different applications, which one does support single sign-on, like Kevin was saying. If they don't support SSO or they make you pay for it, it's really time to, maybe look and see, does the other application do this better? But maybe, I don't know if Mike or Kevin want to kind of touch a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I think you need to have some basic governance in place, especially if your company is serious about cybersecurity, and every company should be in this day and age, that, says, hey, any new application that comes into the company has to have IT involvement, because that's the opportunity at that point to make sure that that application passes, muster, whatever your standards are. In this case, does it support single sign-on, and in what capacity? So just to add that check to your onboarding list for any new app. Some people like to test things out individually. That's fine, but especially if you want to bring in an app to the entire org or start using it on your team, it's really important that there's IT involvement there so you can partner up on a proper onboarding versus, discovering that app later after, 30 people are actively using it and then going through the disruption of trying to integrate it into SSO. Not the end of the world, but also it can be a little cleaner if it's done on the upfront.
And Christian, once we have Okta set up, how easy is it to add an approved application? So let's say we've gone through it, right, and the application, integrates with let's use Okta as the example. How easy is it to pull that in and roll it out?
Yeah, absolutely. In the case of, in the examples that we talked about, customer number 2, we kind of alluded that they added new electronic lab notebook software. The amount of total time that I spent on that rollout from an Okta perspective was maybe about a half hour. working with a vendor to just set up the federation, the single sign-on. Once I did that, we assigned a couple of people as test users, and they were in. I mean, never mind the other, actually, training the end users on the inside on how to use that specific application, but to actually onboard the app so it was usable by a test group was under an hour of effort just to roll it out. No distribution of passwords and logins and links and things like that. It was all controlled right through the Okta interface. Very, very simple and a huge time saver.
So the best practice is every app should be controlled by the SSO before they go into production. You need to make sure that it gets integrated, and as long as you have a governance process in place and you're supporting department heads and users with that invitation to weave the new application into the process, people should be happy and it should be a good experience for everybody.
Absolutely.
Okay, and just on a very practical level, Bob asks, how do you know if certain applications support SSO? I mean, what are some of the standards? And what are some of the standards? And like, how do you just know if an SSO, if the particular app is supported by SSO?
Yeah, I get asked this a lot, and you can look it up. They're sort of the standard apps. So in the case of Okta, if you go to their website or you Google the Okta Integration Network, and it'll bring you to a page where you can type in the name of an app, and it'll actually show all the list of applications, and it'll tell you if it supports SAML, which is single sign-on. SAML stands for Security Assertion Markup Language, and it's just the technology that it uses in the back end. Not all applications are listed in there. There are applications that support this standard that aren't listed in the integration network. So all we have to do is pick up the phone and reach out to the vendor and make sure that it's a supported application.
Yeah, ask the vendor if they support it. If you already own Okta, you can also just go into their app catalog, type in the name, and it'll tell you right there. It supports SAML or SAML plus what they call provisioning, which is fantastic if that is the case, because then you simply assign that application to the person in Okta. It'll reach out to the target application and set it up for the user. So you want to talk about a simple setup. Sometimes it can be as easy as putting someone in a group in Okta, and boom, they get the new application and you don't have to do anything. So it's easy to check that from within the platform, or contact the vendor.
Yeah, the other thing you need to look at with the vendors is that sometimes they'll have different tiers of software, right? And this is actually pretty important, where they'll only support single sign-on if you're utilizing their enterprise version of the software. So yeah, so as simple as both Kevin and Christian mentioned, you can just go call them, check their portal, look at the integration site. But it's also really is important to understand what version you're running, and if that version supports it, even though that vendor might support it, you have to make sure you're in the right version.
Right, and one quick note, this is sort of a side. Other folks I know who work in the industry have stated that let's say you have an application that you're on their business version or their professional version, but you need the enterprise version to unlock SSO. Sometimes a simple call to an account manager, sometimes they'll turn that on for you, because they value the security. They know that they don't want to have to deal with any breaches. So it is possible to sort of cut a deal in a sense, and talk to those application vendors and see if they'll add that in, especially if you're trying to win their business.
Okay, different question. Michael, you were talking earlier about the client that needed kind of the audit trail for compliance and regulations, industry regulations. Can you talk a little bit about how SSO usage is tracked? What's the logging? What kind of visibility and granularity do you get there?
So there's a couple ways to do it, and Christian's actually better suited to answer the question. So we actually partner with another organization that's an outsourced security operations center, and that gives you another level of auditability and logging. And and the reason I bring this up is because this organization not only just looks at stuff that's happening within single sign-on, but it looks across what's happening on your network, what's happening on your local workstation, across all of the applications themselves. And it's looking at as I mentioned before, this is actually where we caught the somebody who was trying to log on to a user's cloud-based system from Canada, right? So what it does is it collects all of that data and it does corollary logging. So it says, okay, I'm going to look at all these different events, and I'm going to see, is there a couple of things that when I piece them together that are cause for alarm, right? And as I mentioned before, that impossible travel of Canada to Boston, Massachusetts. And so that's adding on like another like higher level layer. But from a just auditability standpoint within some of these things, yes, there's logs and then there's reporting that show you exactly, who has access, who's in what group, what that group has access to. And some of the situations, it can even show you, how often that application is being logged into, right? How often they're accessing that particular application. But I'm not as well qualified to answer it as Christian, so I'll let him chime in here as well.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of touched on the big things. I mean, Okta does have some really good logging capabilities, but when you layer on an additional a SIM product like that, you can actually have them maintain those logs for numerous years if needed. So, if there really is compliance required, so if you just need some logs to see, like usage logs and so on, you can absolutely generate your own reports and have that and be able to look at it. But if you have some sort of compliance or regulation where you need to keep those logs sort of locked and hidden away for a certain amount of time, that's where those additional products are great to be able to store those logs where they can't be modified or tampered with.
Yeah, but from the audit that I mentioned before, the key in that particular situation was they can when the audit is happening, we can log into Okta and say, here's everybody, here's how it's configured,
Yep.
Here's how we're forcing authentication, here's how it's protected. Every single app we use is in this, so it's enforced in this particular way, right? There's no way around it, right? So that was really key for them.
Yep.
Okay, and then maybe just kind of a final question to kind of come back to the user. I mean, maybe this one is one for Kevin and Michael and Christian. You guys can comment as well, but just talk to us a little bit about how, users or an organization, the mass of the employees usually react after a solution like this gets deployed. What's some of the feedback you hear from people?
I think it is. I guess depends largely on how large the company is. There's definitely some organizational change management with bringing on single sign-on, particularly when you're integrating something as big as like Office 365. That takes a lot of planning and coordination and training. But generally, I find if you put out the proper training materials, hold office hours, set up the ability for people to come and ask questions, and really do a lot of hand-holding when particularly setting up the mobile phones. That's usually where people get stuck, I find, is, hey, I don't know how to download this app on my phone and scan the barcode on the screen and set that up. If you walk people through that, it goes a long way, I find, in the adoption. Once that's all done and in place and you're over that hurdle, then people really see the benefit. Like, this is great. I feel like this is secure. And also, it's very convenient. Again, I'm repeating this, but I can go to one place and log into my apps. That's probably the biggest benefit I find, with people, is they really love that one-stop shopping experience with getting access to their portfolio of applications.
Right, especially as it relates to like somebody brought up the password manager thing, right? Without this, it's all right. What's my username? Or maybe it's my email, my corporate email. And which password did I use? And if you don't have a password manager and you're writing it on stickies, or you have an Excel spreadsheet on your laptop, I mean, those are all huge no-nos, right? But from the user experience, as Christian mentioned, he has 200 passwords. I'm probably in the 150 ballpark. And it's made my life so much easier where, when I log into that portal, I just go, I click on the thing I need, it takes me right to where I need to go. It's, it saves me mouse clicks and just time, right, from going to the password manager and pulling it out and so forth. Like, it's, as a user, I love it.
Yeah, the other thing I throw out too when we onboard, multi-factor authentication is, you know, hey, in exchange for this, we'll turn off the requirement for you to change your password every 90 days, which, you know, honestly, it's no longer recommended by, you know, security frameworks or even Microsoft at this point to have that change, because it hasn't proven to be effective. And also it rains down, you know, help desk tickets when somebody changes a password on a Friday or Saturday, and all of a sudden they're locked out and are having all kinds of problems. So, you know, it's best in my experience to relax that restriction. And once you have MFA in place, you know, people arguably don't need as crazy complex a password as they did before, because you're really trying to rely on just the password. In this case, somebody gets the password, but they don't have your phone, they're stuck. And that's really what you're trying to do is slow that down so they'll go somewhere else and attack somebody else's that doesn't have, you know, MFA in place. And that's, you know, you achieved a good goal if you can do that. They can move on.
Right. And another thing I mentioned, we were taking some slides out earlier, is you know, you can also do things like trusted devices, right? So if people are trying to log in from a device that isn't trusted, even if they have a username and password, it doesn't matter, right? Because the device is not a trusted device, so you can't even get through.
Right.
Right.
Fantastic. So with the right proper planning and deployment and training, the user experience is really slick. There's a lot of benefits for the users in all of this down the road. So that's really key. Michael, if there's NENS clients or prospective clients that want to learn more about this, how do they get in touch?
So I'm hoping you can still see the presentation, but they can email me directly if they'd like. You can email info@nens.com. If you are an existing client, definitely reach out to your account manager. You know who your account manager is. And if for some crazy reason you don't, feel free to reach out to me.
Okay, well that kind of exhausts all the questions and our time for today. So I want to thank everybody for joining us for this informative discussion around single sign-on technology, how it might be a fit for your organization, how you can use it, how it helps users and organizations improve their security. I want to thank our special client guest, Kevin Dushney. Kevin, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. That was helpful.
And Michael and Christian, another great security conversation from the team at NENS. Thanks a lot, everybody, and we'll look forward to seeing you on a future NENS webinar. Take care.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.